I spent 40 years building a life for my family, and I almost ended it in 40 seconds because I was too arrogant to admit I was tired. Look at me. I'm 61. For most of my life, I was the rock. I was the contractor who stayed on the job site until the last nail was driven. I was the engineer who could find a flaw in a blueprint from across the room. I defined myself by my utility, by the fact that I never complained, never slowed down, and never, ever asked for help. In my world, toughing it out wasn't just a habit, it was my religion. I had a comfortable house, a wife who still looked at me like I was her hero, and grandkids who thought I was invincible. But beneath that patriarch mask, I was starting to feel a different kind of weight. It wasn't just the years, it was a desperate, quiet hunger to prove that 60 was just a number. I wanted to show the world, and maybe myself, that I could still outwork men half my age. I didn't want to be the old man in the recliner. I wanted to be the man in the arena, forever. It's hearing stories like this that makes us realize how many people still judge age the wrong way, isn't it? Life doesn't stop at 60. If you agree with this and are also here to help break these myths, please leave a like on this video. This tells YouTube that this topic is important and helps our channel bring this message to more people. Take a moment to subscribe so we can continue this journey together. And that's when the temptation crawled in. It wasn't a woman or a shady investment. It was the invincibility complex. It started about 3 months ago. A Tuesday morning, 7 a.m. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a simple cup of coffee. Just a normal day. But as I went to take a sip, the world shifted. My vision blurred, just for a second, and my heart didn't just beat, it skipped. It felt like a heavy stone had been dropped into my chest. I stood there, frozen, staring at the steam rising from my mug. My wife, Sarah, was right there, humming some tune at the stove. All I had to do was say, "Hey, I feel a little strange." That's it. One sentence. But I didn't. I felt the sweat prickle on my forehead, and I told myself it was just the humidity. I told myself I'd stayed up too late watching the news. I rebranded a life-threatening collapse as just a busy week. I chose the silence of my own pride over the safety of my own life. I looked at that cup of coffee, forced a smile, and walked out the door like nothing happened. I thought I was being a man. I thought I was being strong. I had no idea that I had just signed my own death warrant, and the clock was already ticking. For the next few weeks, my life became a series of calculated lies and desperate negotiations with my own heartbeat. Every morning, I'd wake up feeling like I'd just finished a 12-hour shift at the construction site, even though I'd spent the night in a comfortable bed. The fatigue wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow, rhythmic theft of my soul. I started taking secret naps. I'd tell Sarah I was heading to the hardware store or checking on an old client, but instead, I'd pull my truck into the back of a grocery store parking lot, recline the seat, and just vanish for 30 minutes. I was a 61-year-old man hiding in his car like a teenager, all because I was too terrified to admit that the rock was starting to crumble. The dilemma was eating me alive. On one side, there was this screaming intuition telling me that something was fundamentally broken inside my chest. On the other, there was 40 years of pride, the ego of a man who provided, who protected, and who never, ever became the burden. I looked at Sarah across the dinner table and I wanted to scream, "I'm scared. I think I'm dying." But then I'd think about the look of pity in her eyes, or the way my grandkids would stop seeing me as their hero and start seeing me as a patient. I chose the silence. I chose the mask. I convinced myself that if I just worked harder, if I just touched it out one more day, the heaviness would eventually give up and leave. Then came the point of no return. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was in the garage trying to move a few boxes of old tiles, something I've done 1,000 times. Halfway through, my left arm didn't just ache, it went ice cold. It felt like I'd plunged it into a bucket of slush. My lungs burned, and for a split second, I couldn't remember how to move my legs. I sank onto a crate, gasping for air in the shadows of my own home. Right then, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a final reminder from the cardiologist's office for the screening I'd already postponed twice. This was it. My final exit ramp. I stared at that screen for what felt like an eternity. I could hit confirm and face the truth, or I could hit cancel and keep the lie alive. I thought about the utility of my life. I thought about the man I'd built. With a trembling thumb, I hit cancel. I didn't just skip an appointment, I deleted my own safety net. I stood up, ignored the cold numbness in my fingertips, and walked back into the house with a smile plastered on my face. I had officially traded my life for my pride, crossing a threshold where there was no more room for maybe. I was all in on a gamble I was destined to lose. After I hit cancel on that appointment, a strange thing happened. I didn't feel worse. I felt powerful. It was a rush, a sick kind of euphoria that only a man blinded by his own ego can understand. I convinced myself that I had stared down a ghost and won. I told myself that the cold numbness in my arm was just a pinched nerve, and the heaviness in my chest was just the weight of a life well lived. For a few weeks I lived in a total mirage. I was everywhere. I spent that Saturday power washing the entire deck, working under the blistering sun for 6 hours straight. I saw Sarah watching me from the kitchen window, and I made sure to stand a little taller, to move a little faster. I wanted her to see the man she married, not the patient I was terrified of becoming. I was back, or so I told myself. I felt like a god in my own backyard, validated by every task I completed. I even started thinking, see, those doctors just want to put you on a pill and take your money. You just needed to stop being soft. It was the ultimate honeymoon phase, a celebration of a victory that didn't exist. But looking back now, I can see the cracks I was so desperate to hide. I was fine, as long as I was moving, but the second I sat down, my heart would thud against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd catch my reflection in the hallway mirror and see a man whose skin looked like gray parchment, but I'd just splash some cold water on my face and call it exhaustion. I was vibrating with a nervous energy that I mistook for a second wind, when in reality it was my body's final, desperate attempt to keep the engine running on empty. I was building my life on a foundation of sand, and I was actually proud of how high I was stacking the bricks. I know there's a man watching this right now who feels that same heaviness in his chest every morning. You've had a good week, and you think you've finally turned the corner. You're telling yourself it was just the stress, or the coffee, or the years. You feel that surge of control because you've managed to ignore the pain for 72 hours. Please, be honest with me in the comments. Are you currently in that honeymoon phase? Are you ignoring a signal right now because you're addicted to the idea that you're still invincible? Don't let your silence be your legacy. Tell me your story before it tells itself. The high of that honeymoon phase didn't just fade. It curdled like milk in the sun. The illusion didn't just crack, it shattered during the most mundane, beautiful moment of my life, and that's when the first bitter truth finally hit me. It was Sunday evening. The smell of Sarah's roast beef was filling the house, a smell that usually meant safety and comfort. My 5-year-old grandson Leo was tugging at my jeans, his eyes wide with excitement. "Grandpa, lift me up. I want to see the bird's nest in the wreath." Normally, I'd hoist him onto my shoulders without a second thought. I reached down, smiling, ready to play the hero one more time. But as I braced my core, the bitter truth stopped asking for my permission and started taking what it wanted. My left arm didn't just go cold this time, it went completely dead. It felt like a 100-pound lead weight was suddenly bolted to my shoulder. When I tried to lift him, my world didn't just blur, it went grayscale. The heaviness in my chest transformed into a localized, white-hot pressure, like someone was trying to drive a railroad spike through my sternum. I didn't lift Leo. I stumbled backward, my legs turning into jelly, and knocked over a heavy dining chair. The sound of that chair hitting the hardwood floor was the loudest thing I've ever heard. It was the sound of my secret life ending. I looked up, gasping for air that felt like it was being filtered through a thick, wet cloth. I saw Sarah's face. The hero mask I'd spent 40 years polishing didn't just slip, it disintegrated. For the first time, I didn't see admiration in her eyes. I saw pure, unadulterated terror. The rules of the game had changed, and they were cruel. I realized that my stamina, the currency I'd used to buy my pride, was officially bankrupt. The tension was no longer a quiet hum in the background. It was a screaming siren in the room. I tried to say, "I'm okay," but the words were trapped behind a throat that felt like it was being squeezed by a giant fist. I was losing control of my muscles, my breath, and my dignity all at once. I wasn't the patriarch of the family anymore. I was a man collapsing in front of a 5-year-old. The adventure of toughing it out was over, replaced by the cold, hard reality that my body had become my captor. I had no more cancel buttons to push, and the ground was rushing up to meet me. Even after hitting that floor, even with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth and Sarah's terrified sobbing echoing in the hallway, I didn't surrender. I did something far more dangerous. I doubled down on the lie. I looked at the woman I've loved for 40 years, pushed myself up with my one good arm, and spat out a lie so pathetic it should have made me choke. I tripped on the rug, Sarah. My old football knee just gave out. "I'm fine, just leave me alone for a minute." I spent the next 2 weeks building a fortress of solitude out of my own arrogance. I started avoiding everyone who actually knew me. I stopped answering calls from my brother, a man who spent 30 years in nursing and would have seen through my "I'm just tired" routine in 5 seconds. I ghosted my old foreman, the guy who used to rely on me to lead the crew, because I couldn't stand the thought of him seeing me struggle just to walk to the mailbox. I chose to be a king in a kingdom of one, even if that kingdom was a darkened bedroom where every breath felt like pulling thick mud into my lungs. The excuses became my religion. To Sarah, I said the stress of the economy was keeping me up. To my kids, I said I was taking it easy to enjoy retirement. But the truth was, my world was crumbling behind the scenes. Because I was too weak to work, the consulting side gigs I relied on dried up. The medical bills I was terrified of, the ones I thought I was avoiding, started piling up anyway. But now they were accompanied by late fees and the crushing weight of a house that was falling into disrepair because I couldn't even hold a screwdriver without my vision swimming. I was drowning in a sea of my own making, and I had pushed away every single person who could have handed me a life jacket. I sat there in the dark, my heart thudding a jagged, uneven rhythm against my ribs, convinced that dying in secret was better than living as a failure. I had traded my family, my friends, and my future for the cold, empty comfort of being the man who never complained. I was alone, I was broke, and I was running out of time. And the worst part is, I was the one who locked the door from the inside. I woke up on the oil-stained concrete of my garage with the smell of gasoline in my nose and the taste of copper in my mouth. I don't know how long I was out. Minutes? Hours? The world was tilting, spinning on an axis of pure, blinding agony. That railroad spike I'd been ignoring for months? It had finally been driven all the way through my spine. I tried to reach for my workbench, the bench I built with my own 2 hands, the symbol of my strength, but my fingers just clawed at the air. I was a 61-year-old man, paralyzed on the floor like a broken toy, staring at the underside of my truck. And that's when the Widowmaker finally introduced itself. It wasn't just a heart attack, it was a total systemic surrender. When the paramedics finally cut my favorite work shirt off me, I saw Sarah standing in the driveway. She wasn't crying anymore. She was hollow. She looked at me not as her husband, but as a stranger who had been committing slow-motion suicide in her own house for months. The humiliation was worse than the pain. Being carried out on a stretcher in front of the neighbors I'd spent 20 years trying to impress with my toughness. That was the first death. But the second death happened in that ICU bed. The doctor didn't mince words. He looked at my charts, then looked at me with a disgust that burned worse than the surgery. "You didn't almost have a heart attack, Leo," he said, his voice cold. "You've been actively dying for 3 weeks. You walked around with a 99% blockage because you thought you were too manly to sit in a waiting room. Because I waited until the absolute catastrophe, the easy fix, was gone. The emergency surgeries, the weeks in specialized care, the months of rehab I'd need just to hold a fork. It didn't just break my body, it liquidated everything. I looked at the bills piling up on the hospital tray and realized that the provider had officially bankrupted his family. My savings, the equity in the house I'd spent my life paying off, the grandkids' college funds, it was all being swallowed by the cost of my arrogance. I sat there in that thin, sterile gown, feeling the cold air on my skin, and finally looked into the mirror. I didn't see a rock. I didn't see a patriarch. I saw a thief. I had stolen a husband from Sarah and a grandfather from Leo, all because I was too addicted to the lie of my own invincibility. I was the architect of this ruin. I had designed every pillar of this nightmare, and now I was the only one left to sit amongst the rubble. I had nothing left. No pride, no money, and very nearly no pulse. I was 61 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was absolutely, terrifyingly small. The silence of a hospital room at 3 in the morning is the loudest thing I've ever experienced. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's the sound of machines breathing for you because you were too stubborn to breathe for yourself. I lay there, staring at the fluorescent lights, finally stripped of every lie I'd ever told. There were no more busy weeks, no more pinched nerves, and no more just getting older. There was only the cold, sterile truth. I had gambled my family's entire future on the altar of my own ego, and the house had finally called my bluff. I looked at my hands, the hands that had laid thousands of bricks and signed off on multi-million-dollar blueprints, and they were shaking. I wasn't the rock anymore. I was a man who had to ask for help just to sit up. That was my final confrontation. Not with a doctor, not with a debt collector, but with the man in the mirror. I had to look at that gray, exhausted version of myself and admit that my strength was actually my greatest weakness. I had equated silence with masculinity, and in doing so, I had almost made my wife a widow and my grandkids an afterthought. The damage control started with a conversation I should have had 10 years ago. When Sarah walked into the room, her eyes red-rimmed and her shoulders slumped, I didn't try to crack a joke. I didn't tell her I'd be back to power washing the deck by Monday. I just reached out my hand, tears stinging my eyes, and said the hardest words a man like me can ever utter. "I'm not okay, Sarah. I'm scared, and I'm sorry I lied to you." There was no victory in that moment. There was no heroic comeback. We both knew the savings were gone, swallowed by the emergency procedures and the weeks of intensive care. We knew the retirement we'd dreamed of was now a mountain of medical debt and physical therapy. But as she gripped my hand, I realized that the fight wasn't about being the hero anymore. It was about the grueling, humbling work of just being there. I'm fighting now not to be invincible, but to be present. I'm fighting to survive the consequences of my own arrogance, so I can walk through my front door one more time, not as a king, but as a man who finally learned that the heaviest thing you'll ever carry isn't a bag of cement. It's the truth you're too proud to tell. I'm sitting here now, in a recliner I once mocked as a waiting room for the end, and I'm forced to look at the wreckage of my own making. The house is smaller. We had to downsize to pay for the miracle that kept my heart beating. A miracle that wouldn't have been necessary if I'd just been man enough to admit I was human. I watch my grandkids play through the window now, instead of chasing them across the grass, because my lungs still haven't forgiven me for those 3 months of silence. My greatest regret isn't the money we lost, or the career I can never return to. It's the look I caught on Sarah's face this morning when I dropped a spoon. It wasn't annoyance. It was a flash of pure residual trauma, the fear that the rock is about to shatter again. I didn't protect her by staying silent. I haunted her. I turned our home into a minefield, where she has to walk on eggshells, waiting for my ego to explode. I thought I was being a provider, but I was actually a thief, stealing her peace of mind to pay for my own vanity. Now I'm looking at you. I know exactly who you are. You're 60, or 55, or maybe just 45, and you're feeling that heaviness right now. You're rebranding your chest pain as indigestion. You're telling yourself you're just tired, Because the world expects you to be indestructible. You think your utility is your only value. Let me tell you something that the ICU taught me. Your family doesn't need a hero who dies in secret. They need a man who is brave enough to be a patient today so he can be a grandfather tomorrow. Your invincibility is a lie, and your silence is a death warrant. Don't wait for the floor of your garage to hit you in the face. Don't wait for the paramedics to cut your pride off your chest with a pair of trauma shears. If you feel that shadow on the stairs, if your heart is skipping beats while you hold your morning coffee, stop lying. Put your ego in the dirt before it puts you there. Go to the doctor. Today. Because the strongest thing you will ever do is admit that you aren't made of stone. Don't let your last act of strength be the one that leaves your family alone at the dinner table. Please, just listen to me while you still have a heartbeat to listen with.